Welcome to this week's meeting of the Tacoma Pierce County Coalition to End Homelessness. It's good to see everyone. Before we get started with Rosemary's kickoff, I do want to alert folks that I am going to slightly shift our agenda around a little bit. We are being joined today by Tacoma City Council member John Hines. Hi, John. I saw you on camera there briefly. And given the interest in what John's going to talk with us about, I do want to shuffle the agenda a little bit. So we will talk about that after Rosemary's opening words. So Rosemary, over to you.
Thank you, Rob, and welcome everyone to our open table, where membership in the coalition means we're committed to ending homelessness in Pierce County and to engaging one another with respect. We acknowledge that we gather on the homelands of the Puyallup tribe of Indians who have stewarded this coastal home for thousands of years. We call ourselves to listen to and uplift the voices and experiences of the indigenous people of this land and beyond. So we're gathered here today and we're going to hear about resources, opportunities for collaboration and advocacy, updates on current issues, and proposed public policy. The agenda is, as Rob said, packed. With so many of us in this Zoom space, we face a real challenge in making this an interactive space. And so today I'm thinking about space and the distribution of power in space. In our coalition community norms, we list what has become a kind of mantra in group organizing, where we say, make space and take space. Oftentimes, this seems mostly a reminder to play nice in the sandbox and to check ourselves so we don't use up more than our fair share of meetings minutes. As participants in a group, we usually rely on meeting facilitators to hold us accountable for this norm, as it can seem either rude or invasive to tell someone, you've used up your time, or why aren't you saying anything? Some of us navigate this challenge with seeming ease and having the Goldilocks space of just enough. Practice in group spaces can help us get better at this, but privileges of gender and race and social class amplify the ease and sense of entitlement some of us feel and some of us don't in these situations. Some of us can appear unaware of the space we take. Others do not share ideas that might really help the group's action, concerned that they would take up too much space. And those of us who might hope to live large in a world that is too often told us to be silent may hold back in concern that we'll be ignored again or not understood. So in centering us on the task before us today, I encourage you to think about ways we can, in our meetings and our organizing, improve our accountability to the norm of making space and taking space. What kinds of practices have been fruitful in other groups you experience? What ways of sharing space might better enable the gift we all bring to this work? Consider sending your thoughts to me in the chat today or by email, which my email is in the agenda. And as a practice for today, I invite all of us to be mindful of our own ways of participating here and in other groups, noting what helps you bring your fullest self to the space, what gets in the way, and what you might do to encourage others to take space. Successful movement to ensure safe and stable housing for all needs all of us living large, making large demands, and being encouraged by one another so we can respond with large hearts. So welcome everyone to our meeting today. And let me just remind those of you who maybe haven't thought of this much or who are new today, that we ask that you use the hand raise function here on Zoom when you wish to be recognized, that you keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking, and that if you're doing other things, to turn your video off as well so we're not distracted. Finally, in terms of Zoom, the chat for this group is a space of interaction. So I encourage you to talk with one another in that place, to send messages, to ask questions. If you've spoken some and want to think about that idea of not taking too much space, make your comments in the chat so we can all hear your thoughts. And we do have a group of community norms. Rob usually posts these. I didn't look at the chat to see, but usually post them. And I just focused on one today. We'll talk about others in other meetings so that we're all clear about these norms as something we try to practice and are committed to. So with that, if anyone's new today, to introduce yourselves, just let us know you're here if you haven't been here before or if you've been away for a while. not a long introduction, just if you're associated with a group or working as a community advocate, whatever your role may be, just to let us know that you're here. That would be great. If you raise your hand, Rob or I will recognize you.
And the first hand I see up is Zara. Is that how you say your name?
Yes, it is. Hey everyone, I'm Zara. I have been homeless before previously. My father was homeless for about 10 years in and out of shelter systems. I recently started working with a couple community gardens. One, Harvest House in Graham, has a really robust food pantry, and they actually have quite a bit of food left over. So I've started processing that food into hot meals that I've been distributing, as well as just distributing other supplies directly to camps that people need, being conscious of the transportation and other preparation logistics that maybe a lot of times people who haven't experienced homelessness aren't quite as aware of. So that's kind of my main focus. I know we won't have time with it today, but I do have a plan written up that I would love to discuss with anybody who's interested, to address goals 4 and 5 of the comprehensive plan to end homelessness specifically. Again, with that focus on harm reduction, being able to provide resources directly to people who need it, with as little logistical considerations as possible, just kind of on the ground. So if anybody has any questions for me or would like to connect, please hit me up in the chat. But I know you guys have a packed agenda, so I don't want to take up too much time here.
Thanks, Zara, and welcome. Good to have you.
Donald Pitchford.
Jennifer. Oh, Donald. Okay.
Yeah, Donald first and then Jennifer.
Yes, I'm just glad to be here. Just really need to catch up on the information and, the things that are happening, in the homeless facility.
Glad to have you here, Donald.
I'm glad to be here.
And then Jennifer.
Good morning, I'm Jennifer Scott. I'm a case manager at Catholic Community Services Family Housing Network. I recently also took over the training for coordinated entry. Kevin Gavalis was doing that before, so I moved into his spot, and I'm happy to be here and sort of start looking into the bigger picture. Thank you.
Glad to have you, Jennifer, and thanks for your work.
Thank you.
All right, if anyone else is new or coming back from a while away and want to give your information in the chat so we can contact you, that would be great. Oh, I see. Andre.
Hey everyone, sorry, I hope this is a proper time to introduce myself, but I just wanted to say I'm Andre Stackhouse. I'm the campaign director of Whole Washington, which is a statewide campaign for universal health care. We're hoping to get it on the ballot, although we do also work through the legislature. And I'm really excited at getting to share more with it, about it with you all, and potentially collaborate. So I'll put my contact information in the chat.
That's great, Andre. Welcome. And that's a great goal. I'm on with it too. Okay, Rob.
All right. So thank you, everyone. One quick reminder, please do use the chat. It's a tool that we retain and use on an ongoing basis. So if you have ideas, comments, want to share your contact information, that's a great place to put it. It gets archived on our website, pchomeless.org. So let's move to our first item on the agenda. Every week we ask people what they see changing on the streets this week. And so this is an opportunity to talk about things like the response to the predicted hot weather that's going to be happening tomorrow. And also an opportunity to talk about just what you're seeing, where people are moving and what the needs are, and how maybe these 63 people who are in the room might be able to help. So with that, let's open the floor and have about 5 to 10 minutes of conversation about what people are seeing on the streets this week. We'll start with Jeffrey.
Good morning, everyone. As you know, there's with the number of sweeps, there's a lot of things going on. Yakima Avenue from 8th to 19th are 4 different encampments right along Yakima Avenue. A lot of people up on G Street. Let's see, down by the post office on 38th. I went by there today or yesterday. There are a lot of people out there, a lot of them, and we're just not getting things built fast enough to accommodate them. So let's all pay attention. I know the site at 35th and Pacific is coming along. Boy, they're spending a lot of money with that heavy equipment. And Veterans Village is doing well. I don't know if anybody's here from the Veterans Village, but there are 3 months of being open. They have housed 12 people. And the place is full. And there's still a waiting list to get in. So there's a lot going on there too. So thank you for your time, and please, please, please push the city and the county to do more faster.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Anyone else with updates on what they're seeing on the streets this week? Donald, I see you raising your hand. And you're muted right now, just so you know.
Yes. I know I really didn't introduce the program. Excuse me, I had a stroke. Excuse me.
Nope, no problem. We can always come back to you if that works.
Our foundation is House of Prayer Foundation. I wanted to say it's a lot of people that we've been catering to a lot of people that are hustling money, and we have stacked our cars and everything with food, dry food, and we give them some money and we give them a box of food. But there's so many out there that are in need like that. People are telling them to get away from their car and different things like that. So we're figuring out a way where we can put money together and go out and give them the food, and versus a couple of dollars, about $10 a piece, as many as we can. So that's what we've been really seeing on the streets.
Appreciate that, Donald. Thank you. And thank you for the work that you're doing in the community. Yeah, thank you. I know I briefly saw a couple other hands up. Jay, you had your hand up, and Keith had his hand up as well.
Out in the harbor, we're seeing a lot more cars, a lot more people parking, and a lot more bus riders coming out here for a little bit, or just skipping Gig Harbor and going to the other end to either go into Bremerton or go out to the KP. And so that has been something that we're seeing is a lot of traffic through, and an escalation of people staying out on the KP in particular, and Gig Harbor having a hard time with parking spaces in particular. So it's definitely an uptick, and our food banks are definitely having some struggle with the load of people having problems with food recently. So those are the two majors that are out here.
Thank you, Jay. And Keith, did you want to say something as well?
Yeah, I just, just as a Tacoma resident, I drive to work every day down Center Street, and I noticed a lot of police action this morning with the sweep across from Tacoma Screw. it looks like they've been kind of doing it for the past week or two, but there was many cars there this morning. So I think that they're probably helping transition the final people who haven't moved yet. So
Yeah. Thank you for that update as well, Keith. So in order to move along with our agenda, I am going to close up this portion of the meeting. I see, Teresa, you offered an update in the chat, and I urge others to do so as well if there's additional information you would like to share about what you are doing on the streets. Let me briefly, I see your question, Andre, regarding the agenda. What I am planning to do, due to the interest in the conversation with Councilmember Hines, is to slightly shift our agenda. Andre, I originally had you scheduled to speak in the second hour of the meeting, but what I'm going to do is we will do our community spotlight here in a moment. That's a 5-minute section. Then we will do a presentation by Nancy from 501 Commons. And then, Andre, if you would have time after that presentation to talk with us about whole Washington for about 5 to 10 minutes, then we can move on to the conversation with Councilmember Hines. So I would like to carve out from at least the last 20 minutes of the hour, potentially more, for that conversation with Councilmember Hines. So let's go ahead and get started with our community spotlight, and I invite Zoe to tell us a little bit about the Tacoma Mutual Aid Collective. Welcome, Zoe.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Rob. Sorry, I was having a little trouble with unmuting there. So thanks everyone for being here. As he said, I'm with Tacoma Mutual Aid Collective. We're an anarchist mutual aid organization that started in 2018, primarily working in Hilltop, that we've expanded in the last year or two. There are a few pieces to what we do. I'm going to start with the most concrete and kind of work out from there. So in our outreach work, we do a lot of the more standard hot meal delivery. We have medics that go out and do that sort of care. And then we also try and host some more specific events that are not just catered to the people we work with, but are like really help designed by. It's very important to us that we not be presumptuous about people's needs, that we address them directly. So part of that work is we do a distribution day as frequently as we can, where we collect survival supplies and are a little more specific than the standard, socks, toothbrushes, all of that. We will also provide things that are specifically asked for and keep a running list and try and get those things out to people. We're not a nonprofit. We are aligned outside of the nonprofit industrial complex. We receive all of our funding from direct donations from the community and have been very successful historically with that. Some of the things we've done recently are a fundraising to distribute, to purchase and distribute fire extinguishers, which is a big need. We've heard from people with smoke season coming up and all of that. We have more for distribution if anyone is interested in getting some out to their camps. They've been a big hit with folks when we've been able to bring them out. We host things like a laundry day where we collect quarters and laundry supplies and post up at usually 4 to 6 different laundromats around the city, and are there all day letting people do as much laundry as they want. And that is also a big hit. We do our best to help transport folks and get them and all of their stuff there and back. We especially like to do those in the fall when everything's rainy and it's so hard to get things dry. We also do some work on the more activist side of things. I spoke briefly about it last week, but one of the big projects we're working on right now is around the meetings that have been taking place at Marlene's, that amongst business owners and the police and all of that. And we're very opposed to the police being involved in homeless response. And, you know, those meetings, without saying anything about Marlene's, they're just hosting. But those meetings have had a lot of vitriol, a lot of really horrible sentiments being expressed. And our work, especially with the People's Assembly, we've talked to folks on the street, especially those in the immediate area, about what's going on there. And some of them have expressed interest in attending those meetings and being able to speak on their own behalf. So we're working with People's Assembly to get people to that meeting and trying to recruit as many people as we can to also come to that meeting for, you know, backup and moral support and to kind of balance the narrative that's being presented there. We're trying to move into some work directly with businesses that seem to care at least a little bit, to, you know, try and help educate them about some proactive solutions they might be able to take, such as hosting porta potties on their property, kind of anything they can do to positively engage folks, and, you know, help solve some of the issues that they keep bringing up relevant to their business, without involving police, without bringing the tweets down. To speak a little bit more about mutual aid in general, as I said, it's generally kind of an anarchist practice, but it extends far beyond that. You know, I never want it to be promoted as kind of a new thing that was invented in that community. People have been taking care of each other forever. You know, we ended a lot of that with colonialism, and so I would never, we're not ended that, it still thrives, but you know, historically, that has been, you know, challenged as much as possible. Some early examples of mutual aid are groups like the Latin Kings or the Black Panther Party, who started the school lunch program, and just the kind of general people serving people, and, you know, kind of the thing we pose as opposed to nonprofits is the work we do is all shaped by the community. We're all in service to each other. There aren't, you know, givers and takers. It's, we don't, we're, you know, anti-paternalistic. We trust.
Appreciate that. So, so I know we're running short on time.
Okay.
I do urge you to drop information in the chat of how folks can contact and kind of coordinate with
Yeah,
Tacoma Mutual
absolutely.
Aid. And I see Teresa has her hand up.
Yeah, just if you could also drop in the chat how people could get help for someone through you, and if there are specific things that you need that we could help with, things you're looking for, that sort of thing. If you put that in the chat, it'd be great.
Absolutely. And just one quick thing, something we've been talking about is hosting some introduction to mutual aid, and that type of organizing for folks in this room specifically, and those kind of in that nonprofit world interested in other frameworks for doing this work. So if there's interest in that, please let me know, and we'd love to pull something together for y'all.
Fantastic.
With the
So
fire
thank you.
extinguishers, we also have some masks, some good masks to distribute. So I will make sure I drop that info as well. Sorry to go over, Rob. Thanks.
Oh, no, it's okay. Yeah, and I don't like to have to prod the agenda along, but we definitely have a lot to talk about this morning. So appreciate you taking the time to let us know more about Tacoma Mutual Aid. So let's move to the next item on our agenda, and that is a presentation, short presentation by Nancy Long from 501 Commons. So Nancy, kick it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be with you here today. Thank you, Rob, for inviting us. I'm the executive director of 501 Commons, and we recently were the successful bidder for a contract with Pierce County to advance their work over the next 18 months in helping build capacity for BIPOC organizations that are in a kind of a startup or beginning mode. And so I wanted to just introduce myself. I'd like to have our project team come back at some point. We are going to be hiring somebody to work on this project, and I thought it'd be best for me to give you kind of an overview of the project and a little bit about 501 Commons, and then to have the project team come back and introduce themselves, and we will circulate that job description to all of you, and would welcome any folks that you could refer to us who have experience working in BIPOC communities, working on homeless issues, and knowledge of the Pierce County community. Our other project team members include Jan Burrell, who is our who manages our management consulting program at 501 Commons, Sam Hampton, who's the director that Jan reports to, and Dr. Joe Merrill, who's a project consultant, and Carol McCauley, who's a project consultant. That sounds like a lot for an 18-month project, and it's not a ton of money, but we are experts at 501 Commons of taking a meal and making it as big a meal for as many people as possible. And that's what we're trying to do with this grant. It's a limited amount of time. It's a limited amount of money. The problem, as you all know and represent in your comments, is huge. And we want to do the most that we can possibly do in this time period to advance organizations that feel like they would benefit from the services that we provide. If you're not familiar with 501 Commons, we've been around for 30 years. We've worked with about 10,000 organizations at this point. We work with organizations everywhere from somebody who thought of the organization this morning and are calling us to ask for help about their next steps to, organizations with 1,000 employees and millions of dollars. It's absolutely across the spectrum, all types of organizations, all sectors, but it has included quite a large portion of the organizations we've worked with are, of course, human service organizations, and within that, about 150 organizations that we've kind of been able to count up that are specifically housing and homelessness providers, and that includes many organizations in Pierce County. We are a capacity building organization, and of course that has come to mean almost nothing because it means everything. And so I want to talk a little bit about what our approach is to trying to use these funds in the most effective way. One of the things we want to do is use this as an opportunity to acquaint organizations, particularly organizations that are all volunteer organizations that are in kind of startup mode towards becoming a staffed organization. We can be particularly helpful at that point in an organization's history. It's important to recognize that, in the nonprofit world, the vast majority, 75% of organizations have budgets below $1 million. And out of the 53,000 nonprofits in Washington State, only about 6,000 of them have even one paid staff person. So most of our sector is unpaid, most of our sector is grassroots, and that is important to us because we always build our services with a recognition of that, even though we serve larger, more established organizations as well. So one of the things we want to do is really acquaint people with the free services that we have available on a kind of an on-demand basis without a lot of barriers of having to go through a kind of contracting process. We also want to acquaint people, and that includes free nonprofit advisory services, like a half an hour consultant or consult that people can get, just by setting up a meeting. We also do very low cost HR, finance, and technology consultations for people if you just have kind of an immediate need for some piece of information or expertise or some advice. And then beyond that, we do consulting services across the spectrum of anything to do with management consulting, HR, finance, technology, data solutions, services, and boards, planning, all that sort of thing. And then we provide ongoing back office sustained support services in technology, finance, and HR services. And that whole model is built in recognition of the sectors I just described it. Most organizations are not going to be able to hire an IT person or hire a HR person. The vast majority of nonprofits don't have that kind of expertise. And even if they have finance expertise, it may be bookkeeping alone and not kind of the broader finance expertise. So we're structured to provide that to people on a fractional FTE or contracted basis, so people can get that support but not have to kind of struggle to find a staff person to do that. So we want to get people kind of aware of those services and aware of how those services might help them as they build capacity. And for those organizations that are interested in formalizing or are hiring staff for the first time, or are in a mode where they're starting to seek grants for their work, this specific program we believe can be really helpful in helping people use their time and resources well, and find a sort of a pathway forward. At the core of the program is an assessment process that is free to anybody. And so we will be encouraging organizations to use that process, regardless of whether they have signed up to be in this kind of limited time program. And because that can provide a lot of direction and shortcuts for people in addressing issues within organizations. And so that will be part of the process. Another part of the process is to do some community forums and information exchanges, much like what you're doing here, but in a kind of more prolonged time period on particular topics. And we'll be asking for your kind of advice and input on those sessions. And obviously would love to have your participation, both on behalf of your organization and on behalf of the support that you provide to one another through forums like this. So I'm gonna stop with that. There'll be more specific information on the where, how, and when. Once we don't even have a contract actually with the county yet, but we've met with Delmar and his team and found them very welcoming and very supportive, and I think that will be a good relationship, and we look forward to building relationships with those of you who are interested in participating in this program. And I'll be glad to take any questions in chat, Rob, since I know your agenda is tight.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and we definitely look forward to the opportunity to interact with you and your organization moving forward, and collaborate however would be helpful in this.
Great.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much, and do reach out and let me know if when there's a appropriate time that you'd like to spend more time with the coalition.
yes, we'll do that, and we'll circulate a job application to, or job description to you too for this position that we'll be opening. Thank
Fantastic.
you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great day, everybody. Thank you for your work and service.
All right. So Andre, would you like to tell us a little bit about Whole Washington?
Yes, I would. And if I could be given screen sharing, I'll try to give a really condensed version of my regular presentation. I'm also dropping 2 links in the chat for everyone. So one of them is the slides that I'm about to show you. And then the other is the FAQ page, which we might not get through all the questions. So I encourage people to take a look and see if your question's already answered. And that will give us time for more in-depth stuff. So I'm the campaign director of Whole Washington, and I just like to start by introducing the org. So Whole Washington, we're a nonprofit 501c4 founded in 2017. And as of right now, we're 100% volunteer run, all the way down to a signature gatherer up to the campaign director. So this is a grassroots effort. And these are some useful links: volunteer, donate, and the FAQ page, which I already put in the chat. WholeWashington.org is the website though, and it's an incredible wealth of knowledge. So I encourage you to check it out when you get the chance. And our slogan is healthcare that's always there. And we'll get into what that means, but just very briefly, some of the who of Whole Washington. So I'm the campaign director. Georgia and Jen are 2 of our volunteer campaign staff. That's my actual contact information at the top, email and phone number. So please get in touch with me anytime. And our board of directors, don't really have a ton of time to introduce all of them, but they are fantastic. They include former legislators, candidates, nurses, in all sorts of great walks of life. But really, it's a volunteer effort, and so it's not possible to put something on the ballot without a ton of people sharing that dream with you. So it's really the heart and soul of the campaign is volunteers, and we need volunteers of all kinds, writers, scientists, anyone who can gather a signature, someone who has lots of friends and likes to host events. And a growing, really awesome grassroots coalition. So you see that we organize down to the LD level. We have counties, city councils, and a ton of organizations like the Tenants Union, Transit Riders Union, Poor People's Campaign, Tacoma IWW. A couple more that came in, Physicians for Social Responsibility. So we really look to build this coalition and make it a partnership. And so universal healthcare, just as fast as I can go about how this is. So first thing is, we're not talking about buying all the hospitals and making all the doctors government employees. We're actually talking about public health insurance, which is often known as single payer health insurance. And in our case, it would be called the Washington Health Trust. So there'd be an insurance plan from the state of Washington called the Washington Health Trust, and all of us would be on it. And so that's the first pillar, is that it covers everyone, and that's based on residency. So it doesn't matter what your employment situation is or your housing situation. If you live in this state, you're covered. And then it covers everything. So you don't need to pay extra out of pocket. You don't need to have supplemental private insurance. It has your dental, hearing, vision. So even if you have Medicare, for instance, this is expanding it to cover a lot of things that Medicare doesn't cover. And then free at the point of use. So again, you're not handed a bill when you go to the doctor, right? So it's sort of like the fire department. When they come and put out your house, they don't hand you a bill. Doesn't mean that it's a charity. Doesn't mean they all work for free. But it does mean that it's free to use. So this is incredibly important for a universal healthcare system. And so then people usually want to know, how are we going to pay for it? And I always like to say, how are we not going to pay for it? So that's no more deductibles, premiums, copays, medical bills, out-of-network charges. We stop paying all of that. And instead, we're going to make the tax code more progressive. So most of this falls on employers and a 10.5% employer tax. They can share actually up to 2% of that as an employee payroll tax. So I'll show how that works in a second. And then an 8.5% capital gains tax. And that's to really target the highest income people and make this a progressive payment structure. And the first 15,000 are exempt on all of these taxes. And then with that capital gains tax, doesn't touch home sales or retirement accounts. Those are all exempt. And 90% of Washington actually makes less than 10K a year in capital gains. This is showing that employer tax, 10.5%, up to 2% can be an employee payroll tax. So they might choose to cover that as an employment benefit, or you might pay a 2% payroll tax. But again, this is instead of your private premium and all of that private healthcare spending. And then what are the benefits? Most of them are pretty obvious, but some of them that are less obvious. This is cheaper. It's actually cheaper to cover everyone. So it costs $5 to $13 billion less in total healthcare spending. And 95% of Washington will have more money in their pocket at the end of the year. And then it's stable. You don't have a gap because you changed your job or you moved or something like that. More simple. So no bills, no paperwork. And then more fair, a more fair progressive tax code. And we stop putting people into debt and bankruptcy for healthcare, which is actually the #1 cause of bankruptcy, is medical bills in both Washington and federally. This is a quote by MLK that I like to put all of this into context of all the forms of inequality. Injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. And that's really the best way to describe our healthcare system. And how are we going to pass it? So I always start with, we do introduce this into the legislature. So it's in the Senate. It has 7 co-sponsors, but it's been stuck in committee for many years now, never given a public vote or a public hearing, which is why we're really lucky to be able to file as an initiative, which we did this year. And if we can collect 400,000 signatures, it'll be on next year's ballot for everyone to vote on. So we can take this directly to the people. The transition plan is very wonky, but we have one, I think, is the important thing to understand. And on day 1, everybody's eligible. There are some waivers that we will have to apply for in order to cover certain people who are currently covered by, say, Medicare or what are called ERISA plans. So they'll have the option on day 1, but they won't be incorporated by default on day 1 until we get those waivers. And eventually we're going to cover everyone except the VA and Indian Health Services, which are kept separate for very specific reasons. And it's the same with federal Medicare for All, if you're familiar with that. But they would still be able to have any additional things that aren't covered by those services, covered by the Washington Health Trust. And I just like to say that Washington can do this. We've done it before on so many issues like cannabis, abortion, marriage equality, and just like in Canada, their healthcare system started with a single province, Saskatchewan. It is actually not a liberal province or an urban province. It is a rural and conservative province, but it was the start of their healthcare revolution. And I always remind folks that the ACA came from the state of Massachusetts, where it was formerly known as Romneycare. So the point is that the states have incredible influence over federal policy. And this is a way for us to lead with our example. These are 6 states that expanded Medicaid, but they did it on the ballot. Their governor was against it, their legislature was against it, but their people wanted it, and it was a winning issue. And you'll notice that with the exception of Maine, these again are rural conservative states. So this is a winning issue no matter where you are, because everyone needs healthcare. So if you want to get involved, wholewashington.org/volunteer. It's a very fast form, so you could fill it out by the end of this presentation. If you want to sign, you can find a place to do so, wholewashington.org/sign. And you'll see that we have bins all across the state where you can swing by and sign the petition. And you can even pick up sheets if you're ready to start collecting with us. We also do many events, so wholewashington.org/event, and you might find us at a fair or something like that. We're at the state fair and the county fair. And of course, we always ask for an endorsement. So if your org is ready to endorse, or you want me to present at one of your orgs, I'm happy to do so. And you can just go to wholewashington.org/endorse wholewashington when you've decided to do so. And I hope I've been respectful of your agenda time. If there's any time for questions, I am happy to take them.
Great. Thank you so much, Andre. And thank you for a very quick and information-filled presentation. If folks have questions, why don't you go ahead and put those in the chat, and hopefully you can hang in with us for a few minutes, Andre, and answer those if that come up. And thank you again for coming and talking to the group this morning.
Mhm.
All right, so let's shift over, and I would like to invite Tacoma City Council member John Hines to share with us some information about the proposal related to creating buffers around city-sanctioned sites within the Tacoma city limits. And this is a topic that will come to the city study session on the 13th, if I remember correctly. So Tuesday at noon. So Councilmember Hines, you have the floor.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you all for letting me be here with you this morning. I really appreciate the time to chat with you a little about what I'm proposing, at least for Tuesday with the whole council. So simply, and I drop in the chat box the council action memorandum, or the CAM, so you can look at that. It has all the materials inside of it. But the proposal is simply saying, is looking at our current temporary sites here in the city of Tacoma, and I'm putting up a 10-block buffer around them where people could not set up encampments or store public property, or store goods on public property. So 10-block buffer. The link I dropped in the chat has the CAM, and then at the bottom there's the very last page is the map of where it would apply. But to be specific, we're talking about the 6 current temporary shelter sites. So just to make sure I get these correct, it would be the Stability site on Puyallup Avenue, the Thames site number 3 on 6th and Orchard, which is, I'm pointing like you could see it, but it's a block away from my house right there. The Thames site number 4 off of 69th and Proctor Street, the mitigation site on 82nd and Pacific Avenue, the Rise Center that's going to be on Hilltop on 21st and Martin Luther King, and then the mitigation site that's going to be opening here soon on 35th Pacific Avenue. It's also going to include the 3 current temporary shelters that are where we have churches that are helping sponsor them. So that'd be Alzheimer Memorial, Bethlehem Baptist on 48th and Pacific, and our Portland Avenue, and then Shiloh Baptist. So the idea would be, there we go. The idea would be that there would be there's shelter around the temporary shelters would be a 10-block buffer in which you could not camp or set up encampments. And that's the basic framing, the idea behind it. So you can kind of see what parts of the city would be covered by the map, what parts of the city would not be covered. And so my point with this is just to begin the conversation with the council here on September 13th. The council had a conversation last year, as many of you know, around Councilmember Thomas had a proposed camping ordinance that would have not allowed camping across the whole city, if there were, but it could only be enforced if there was shelter available. At the time, one of the things I told him was, I don't think that will be effective, because just being able to track what shelter's open, what's there, it just didn't seem like it made a lot of sense to me. So at that point in time, I talked about, what about looking at certain parts of the city where we wouldn't allow camping as a starting point to address some of the encampments we have in our city. And so that process went through the CVS committee. They came back with a report, and it was very clear around saying, the path forward is providing housing for everyone, and that's the best way to move forward on this. And I would begin with just saying, where I probably agree with many of you, we do need to provide shelter and housing for a lot of people in our community that we're seeing. And I heard from many of you today that there are lots of people out on the street. And I went to Gray Middle School on Tuesday, and I drove back, and I drove past St. Vincent de Paul, Burlington, the site that's behind the post office on 38th. And then I drove down past Tacoma Rescue Mission to the other side on Pacific Avenue. So I see the need. There's a lot of people out there on the streets that need shelter. And so the idea with this is, what I'm trying to do is tie the provision of shelter to the prohibition of camping, right? So simply enough, that the way we get to, if we ever get to a point where we're not allowing people to camp on the streets, it's because there's shelter provided somewhere in a neighborhood. So where we set up these temporary sites, people can't camp within a certain distance of it. It's just drawing a real clear connection between we're providing shelter and people aren't allowed to camp. So those are that's the basic idea behind it. One of the reasons why I've landed here, I still had a couple of questions I've already talked to people about. You're the first large group I've had a conversation with about this, but in talking to individuals who've asked me questions. The question was, well, John, how did you land here? And the first question was one of the things that how did I get here? And one is I've been thinking about this for quite a while about what a policy might look like to get to the point where we can get to say, well, here's where you can be in the city and here's where you can't be. And so this is kind of a beginning part of that. It's a place to start where we've provided shelter and around those areas you can't camp. And then the other piece of this is just thinking about the health and safety around encampments, right? Because one of the conversations that came out of when we talked about the campaign last time was we talked a lot about, how do we end homelessness in Pierce County, right? And I think we all agree on the path forward, which is shelter, housing, services for people that are currently on our streets to get them off our streets into more stable environments. But what I think was missing in that conversation was the impacts of encampments. And that's both the impacts of encampments on the people who encampments have set up in their neighborhood or in front of their business, but more importantly, the impact of encampments on the people who currently live inside of them. Encampments are not healthy or safe for anyone. And so looking at ways we can address encampments, providing shelter, and kind of moving forward. And so that's kind of where we landed on. So I'm seeing questions pop up in the chat. And so I want to answer questions and I want to make sure I'm answering questions as much as I can instead of just kind of going forward. So let's see. We can
do this multiple ways. Would you like to address the questions in the chat or would you like folks to raise hands?
Well, I'll just work my way down I can work my way down the chat questions if that works, or people can raise their hand either way. But like Sherry Jensen asked about the 10 block buffer, where folks cannot set camps. Does that mean that we'll be allowed to set camps outside? What it means is currently, so as part of the buffer, as you can imagine, there is going to be and be honest, there's a criminal penalty associated with camping inside the buffer zone, right? So that's just how we enforce it. And so what would happen is if someone was camping inside the buffer zone, we first begin with education and outreach, trying to find people shelter and where they can find shelter. Now, I know the first thing someone's going to say to me, which is like, well, John, if they're camping next to the Thames 3 site, which is in your neighborhood, and they're a single male, they can't go to that site. So how does that make sense? And my point is thinking more broadly about the shelter system. And the city has a lot of places for people to go in our temporary system, but there's also places for people to go in systems beyond that, other housing options. And so what it would mean is if you were camping there, approach housing, shelter, this is my interpretation based, because I'm talking about policy, but there's an administrative piece to this. If someone then said, no, I don't want shelter option, I want anything, then it would say, well, you have to move outside of the buffer area because we have a shelter it's right here and you need to move beyond this certain point. And that would be it. Now, the criminal penalty, if there was a criminal penalty, would be then someone who would set up an encampment inside the buffer zone who then absolutely refused to move. And what we found, I don't know, most often people do move when they're asked to move. And so I don't feel like that's going to be something we're going to run into very often in other cities that have put in these things, have had very few, if any, citations for this. So so they could move to the edge. And so one of the questions so that would be one of the things. Okay, let's see. Whoa, a lot of questions here. Okay, I'm working my way back up to the top.
And I know the questions are going to be a bit overwhelming. There's obviously a very...
And Rob, your question was, how do we land on 10 blocks, right? So I will be honest, let me back up. We started with, my first question was, well, we already have so an example would be, we already do it through the code in lots of ways where we say we think something should be far enough from something else, right? We say, hey, this should be a certain distance away from this, right? We don't let people smelt iron in a residential neighborhood, right? So we all recognize that we decide certain things should not, the city constantly discusses where things should and should not be with it that's appropriate. And so one of the first parts we landed was well, what about 1,000 feet, right? Or 2,000 feet from one of these shelters. And then one of the staff members said, well, Councilmember, are you going to mark off 1,000 feet or walk off 2,000 feet for people? And the answer was yes, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So 10 blocks was meant to be, blocks are visible, they're clearly delineated. You can say street names, numbers, so it makes it very clear and visible. Another reason of 10 blocks is the city of Everett has a similar policy like this around one of their streets, I think Smith Street or Shaw Street, where they have a tiny home village they set up in one business district, and then they don't allow people to camp within 10 blocks. So 10 blocks is a starting point. And again, I said, this is beginning of a conversation. It's going to be at study session next week to get more information. Rob.
Yeah, so I see Jeffrey has his hand up. Why don't we go to him next?
Councilman Hines, if you're talking 10 blocks, you're talking almost a mile, a square mile. And if you're trying to house all these people who are out there, you're cutting off a big part of the city where shelters can be. Where are these people supposed to go? Where are these people supposed to go?
No, and
if you're telling them to go down, no, if you're telling them to go down to the industrial center, where are the services? Where are the stores? There's nothing down there. Let's pay attention to maybe a smaller block, not 10 blocks, but maybe 5, where you're still opening up areas where people can be without being criminalized. And at the same time, allowing for the city to continue building mitigation sites.
Yeah. No, and that's a great point, Jeffrey. So let me answer a couple pieces of that, right? Because that was this issue that was raised to me early on, was like, well, John, is that going to mean that people aren't going to build shelter in that 10 block radius? And the answer is no. I mean, it's not going to preclude anyone from setting up a shelter. So you could continue to build shelters in those radiuses. It would just be, there'd be no encampments in there, right? But that we already have 2 sitting right next to each other with Bethlehem Baptist Shiloh and Alzheimer. They're a block apart from each other. So, and then Brotherhood Rise is really, and 35th Pacific, they're all pretty close. So the idea wouldn't be that in those radiuses, the city wouldn't set up another temporary shelter, because we're always looking for partners that want to help us with this. It would just be that would work. But your point about,
no, wait, until you have adequate shelter space, you're still pushing everybody into an industrial area of town where there's no services. There isn't anything.
Well,
pay attention to that aspect of it, because until the city builds the adequate shelters, where are their people supposed to go? Based on your map, the industrial part of town.
Well, I guess the point would be that people would accept shelter opportunities that we have that are currently available, and that we're setting up others. And so another piece of the timing is 30th Pacific's opening up, which is going to be a lower barrier site. And then in talking to some providers, right, we have other groups that are setting up safe parking, other hotels coming online to provide people housing, other tiny home villages. So within the next, from now until the end of the year, we're going to see a lot of beds, shelter spaces coming online, other housing options. So the goal would be that people are moving into those shelter spaces, fewer people are left on the street, and we're not just pushing people off the buffer areas, that they're taking up on some of the housing options that are available.
Is there a sense that the number of shelter spaces that will be created during this interim period, hopefully before this would actually go into effect, would actually come close to matching the number of people who are on the streets in Tacoma?
Well, I think that's a good question for you all in the group, right? Because what I think one of the issues with this too is we are going to be setting up a bunch of places for people to go. But I've often heard from many people here in this group, well, you're offering things that they don't want. So my question would be that as we set up all these shelter beds, I'm sure we're going to find some people who are going to say, I don't want anything that you've offered, and I'm going to move to the edge of the buffer zone. My hope is that when we get to that point, say by the end of the year, we're able to have a really direct conversation with the people who are continuing to not be on the streets, and they're continuing to be there, and like, okay, what is it that's going to help you transition off the streets? What are we missing? What's the piece we're missing? And I would say, honestly, the thing I think we're probably missing is a low barrier place, like a very low barrier site.
Yeah,
that's the missing piece. And what I would say is that I think a policy like this would help support that being cited and set up. Because whenever we start talking about where a low barrier, anytime we talk about citing one of these, even if it's going to be not a problem whatsoever, even if we know it's going to function well, there's a lot of pushback from the community. So the 10th Street site, which is by my house, I see Joe's on the call and Josh, wonderful site, no problems, not an issue. Neighbors have apologized to me because they said really horrible things about me in 2020 about when I fought to get that thing set up. But not a problem. It's been great. Anytime we set something up like that, there's a battle on our hands. And so I thought, my thinking is, if we have this policy in place, when we go to neighborhoods and we find partners that want to accept this help, that would be one of those things, that would be one less of a concern that people have. But I will say, well, I want to answer more questions.
Sure. So there are some hands raised, and I do want to get to those folks. And one thing I did say, Councilmember Hines, in the chat, is I do urge people to keep posting their questions, and we can actually send you the questions after this morning's meeting, so that at least it can kind of be some fodder as you have that conversation on Tuesday at study session. So let's go to Teresa.
So first, I just want to say that any government official coming into this group has some bravery to them, and I appreciate you showing up. This is a difficult situation. I think it does make sense to think about where it's right to have campsites. But if this, let me say this in a more positive way. As you move along this, be sure that when you say people can't camp here, you're not going to have campsites for everybody immediately. So it's going to be important that you set up porta potties, hand washing stations, safety, and some police response to the people who are beating up people in camps, people who are dealing here, who are making the whole campsite unsafe for people who just want a place to camp. If you do not set up structured sanitary campsites, you are going to have other neighborhoods that are not like mine, neighborhoods that are not used to people being homeless and having campers alongside them. You're going to set up such a horrible us-them situation that it's not going to help. It actually won't help. So if you want to make it help, set up campsites that are structured, even if they aren't. I mean, there are lots of communities that can manage on their own if they have some safety built around them. That's one of the missing parts, is a safe place for communities that want to live together in tents to actually live without being harmed.
Yeah, and Teresa, thank you very much. And just to kind of to answer that point, because I'm just going to try to answer a couple of questions I've seen multiple times, right? Which is that I do think that one thing I'm hoping we can have this conversation, I think I hear from a lot of people, is encampments are unsafe, not just for the neighbors who have businesses or houses that come in and complain, but for the people inside of them that are being preyed upon. And nowhere in this legislation do I say homeless people are criminals. What I'm getting to is saying that encampments attract criminal activity, right? They do. And often the people who are unhoused are preyed upon. And so I think what I'm is saying, like, well, we're going to say no camping here, and we're going to try to get people into other shelter options, because having encampments is just not tolerable from a health and safety standpoint. And so that's my goal. The other piece I didn't say earlier, here's the challenge. What I think I'm really trying to do with this piece of legislation is I'm trying to separate encampments from providing shelter in our community, right? Because right now what people think is when you set up a shelter, encampments come right after it. That's what they believe happens. You set up a shelter and encampments are there, and it's bad. That was what people were afraid of with Thames 3. And you know, I have a hard time when I go down to Beth Alzheimer Memorial, if I say, hey, you know, to the general public, the way we end homelessness is providing shelter for people. And I stand outside of Alzheimer Memorial, and they're like, okay, well, Councilmember, there's a huge encampment outside here too. So what about these folks here? And it's like, oh yeah, no, we're going to need to continue to provide more places for people to go, and continue to find all sorts of types of shelter. But I want to separate the providing of shelter that we do, that the providers do, from encampments as much as possible. Because I believe that when the city manages it, when we have providers that run it, it is not a detriment in communities. It's not. The one by my house has not ruined my neighborhood as much as people thought it was going to. So that's another piece of this that I'm trying to get to with my thinking. Okay.
So a couple more hands raised. Ryan?
So what would be the difference between this 10-block radius around your shelters versus what's going on outside the 10-block radius of your shelters?
There wouldn't be much of a difference between the two. I mean, it's just, that's where we would say people couldn't camp with inside the 10-block radius. Outside of it, I mean, it would be then saying, I guess, that people could camp in those areas until the encampments get to such a health and safety issue that they need to be removed, which will still be part of the equation.
So do encampments outside the 10 block radius get some benefit or some relief?
I mean, I think they would, as long as they're not getting so large that they become a real health and safety issue, both for the people around them and then for the people living in them themselves, right? I mean, I think that's the point. This is what I'm getting to. Right? What's that?
That sounds pretty subjective.
I mean, it's tough, right? I mean, that's the challenge, right? Because at what point does it become such a health and safety issue, right? And this is the challenge I have with the public, Ryan, I would say, is at what point does it become such a health and safety issue? Do we need, does it take, I mean, we don't have a point system like the city of Seattle, right? Where it's like, well, if there's been a murder or there's been an assault or there's been, so many things that we remove them. So right now when it becomes such a health and safety issue that they have to be removed. That will still stay there, right? The city manager will have the authority to address encampments to get that big.
Okay.
But
so for me, listening to the description, okay, I see the homeless community is not getting anything new, but people that don't care for the homeless are getting a new tool to persecute them by, okay, if I put 10-bed shelter in my neighborhood, that means that I have license to go abuse anybody within a 10-block radius. And if I put one every square mile in the city of Tacoma, now we have no camping in Tacoma because it's against, it's a way to get rid of homeless people in the city limits.
Yeah, but I guess my question to that, Ryan, would be is if we set up a shelter in every block in the city of Tacoma, wouldn't we have met the need for everyone who was living on the streets? I mean, isn't that the goal?
Yes, but that's something this ordinance wouldn't do. If you set up shelters and get people off the street and into shelters, then that takes care of the problem. Setting up shelters and then saying nobody can camp within 10 blocks of here, now that just gives a vehicle for people that don't like homeless folks to like, oh, okay, so, I'm going to put an ADU in my backyard, call it a homeless shelter, and now, I can police within a 10 block radius, and anybody I find in a tent, I can beat the crap out of them or call the cops.
Yeah, I mean, did my camera turn off? No, well, I moved because people were raising heads. I guess, Ryan, I understand your point. That's not where I think it's going to land. And I also think, though, that the idea that a neighborhood would willingly accept shelter is so far from our current reality that I think moving us in the right direction, that people would want to take a shelter on. They'd want their church to do it. Because right now I get, whenever we talk about one of these sites, even 35th Pacific, where there's currently an encampment sitting there and we're looking to set one up, the neighbors are pushing back. So I think that's just, has been my thought. I understand the point you're making, and I hope that is not what it comes to. But if we can get to a point where more people are willing to set up shelter, I think that's good.
So I think I know there's a lot of high passions obviously in the room, and like others, I definitely appreciate you taking the time to come talk with us. I do have to say I wish that that we could have had a conversation as you were formulating this, so that some of these questions could be worked out a little bit ahead of the proposal. But we are where we're at. Can you talk a little bit about the opportunities that folks are going to have to interact with the full council and what you see as the timeline of this moving forward?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Rob. And like what I would say to you all today, right, is it's going, normally things come to study session and then the conversation then moves from there. So I'm talking to you all ahead of the study session, right? So the council will have, this is my proposal, but yet again, I'm not it's not what I propose doesn't become the rule. It's going to go to the full council. We'll have a discussion on Tuesday at study session. We don't take public comment at study session, but that night is community forum. So people can come in and comment on the study session then. It would then go to first and second reading because it's an ordinance. So there'll be both times to comment on the following 2 Tuesdays in a row. So if I'm looking at my timeline correct, so there'll be community forum on the 13th after study session for people to provide their input. And then if it moves to from first reading to second reading, it would go September 20th and then September 27th. There'd be 2 other points for people to comment. But you know what I would say though, again, and I've been saying this to a lot of people, is at the end of the day, right, I think we agree on what's the destination, right? Housing and shelter for everyone who's currently on our streets. I mean, at least that's where I'm going, right? I don't want to see an encampment in the City of Tacoma because we've housed everybody. You know, I'm very much for helping the people experiencing homelessness in our community. I'm very not a fan of encampments. And so I think there are lots of ways to try to balance those 2 things. And people in this meeting have brought up points for me to consider. And as it goes through the whole council, I would just continue to add, as you come and talk to the council, what are your thoughts on the kind of concerns you have around this? I will just say that we just want to make sure that we're getting as much feedback as we can about this.
So we do have 4 more hands up. If you have the time,
I'll go through the 4. I can go through the 4 hands, then I got to run off.
That would be great. And again, I'll send you the information from the chat just so you're aware of the concerns that have been raised. So the first hand that I see up is Zara.
John, so I wanted to approach this again from the perspective of someone who has been homeless and has experienced intergenerational homelessness. The practical concern that I would like you to think about here is, like Jeffrey said, you're talking about a mile radius. Part of the issue that you're talking about, why camps, in my opinion, as someone who's experienced this, right, are unsafe and are places that are not working for anyone, is because there is this attitude of, we don't care where you go, but you can't stay here. So I made a comment in the chat, and I would ask this to anyone on council or anyone who's considering this. I don't know anyone else's personal survival story, but I have had to move all of my belongings with no car before. I have had to work through the day having, $5 to $10 to spend on food for the entire day. There's nowhere to prepare food in a camp. There's nowhere, you can't buy hot food with EBT. So a lot of times you're hungry, you're sick, you can't afford to buy medicine, and everything you own needs to travel with you. And you're being told by a cop who has a gun, who does have the capacity to charge you as a criminal and further complicate your situation. Again, we don't care where you go, but you can't stay here. I think it's pretty clear when you read through the chat that there's not an adequate amount of shelter beds to serve everyone who's being displaced. In addition, logistically, how are they supposed to get to these shelters? Again, if you have never walked across a city for 2 hours in the middle of the night, and probably like the only 2 sets of clothes you own, God only knows if you even have shoes that are capable of walking a mile. So what I would encourage is, as you're thinking about this, to think about the realistic and practical needs that people need to have met in order to be able to be, like, everyone wants, in my opinion, the same thing. Everyone wants people to be housed, to be fed, to be safe. But very much the attitude that is being given off by a lot of what council is proposing is, we want you out of here because it makes us uncomfortable to look at you. And it makes us uncomfortable to have your safety near us. Because if you're not providing an alternative, better solution, the message that's being received is, I don't care if you're experiencing violence. I don't want that violence near my kids though. And so I would really, really, really urge you to think practically. Again, I mean, literally walk a mile in those shoes and in those socks, right? Carrying a tent, anything that you have for food, any personal items, without having eaten all day. I mean, it's really a lot that you're asking people to do, to then again, be associating it with a criminal charge. And so I think that if you really take the time to listen to the voices and seek out the voices of people who have experienced this, you can find a better solution that works for neighbors, but also works for people who are experiencing this.
I mean, thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah, thank you for your perspective. And let's move on. I would love to see if what Clinton has to add to the conversation.
Hey, thank you. I'll try to make this short. I definitely understand the intuitive aversion to this idea. It sounds like the city's planning to, persecute homeless people further and box them out of the city. But I think that may be missing the forest for the trees here, or sort of missing the main point, which is that, most neighborhoods are going to be extremely resistant and are already extremely resistant, like the North End, to shelter, installing more shelter facilities. And this rule could actually sort of reverse that position. It could change that perspective, because right now, if homeless people are not allowed to be within 10 blocks of a shelter facility right now, then they're going to be pushed into the areas where there aren't shelter facilities, which is going to incentivize those areas to then build shelter facilities. And so I don't know if 10 blocks is the magic number, but this regulation should incentivize more shelter construction. It should reduce these neighborhoods' aversion to building shelters in their community. And so anyway, I don't know the specifics of whether 10 blocks is the right amount, but I do sort of see the wisdom in this rule, even though it's sort of counterintuitive. And maybe, I don't know, I think that's something to consider for everyone, that this could really be a good thing, even though it sort of doesn't seem that way at first blush.
Thanks for that perspective. And I did mention in the chat that idea is mentioned in the preamble, I think, to the proposed ordinance. So Ed, your hand's up next. Oh, wait, no, Kathy was, and then Ed.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try and be brief, but I will be, I don't know how any other way to be but honest. And when I first heard about this, I was like, honestly, why are we even talking about this again? Didn't we put this to rest earlier this year? I signed in on December 6th, I believe, last year to the community forum about ordinance 28756. And I remember that there was a poll taken during that meeting. And during that meeting, the results showed of the people who showed up. So it's not some random sample, it's people who are invested, stakeholders, right? Of those people in that audience, which there was over 200 participants, only 30% of those respondents wanted any kind of camping ban in the city of Tacoma. So it seems to me like this is yet another end run around the will of the people. We don't want it. We don't need it. It's expensive. It costs money to even have this conversation, where we could be putting those funds directly into services that would benefit the homeless. Because what you're forgetting is that the unhoused are our neighbors. There are unhoused people in every neighborhood in Tacoma. Whether people want to recognize that or not, that is the fact. It's just that some are better at hiding because they don't want to be hassled by NIMBYs. They don't want to be hassled by the police. And I do not want the police to be enforcing laws and making it more difficult for people just to survive. If you're going to do this, then what you're going to need to do is, and you don't like to talk about it, but what you're going to need to do is either freeze rent increases or put a cap on rent increases. Because I'm with the Tacoma Tenants Union and we're the prevention people. So how about this idea? How about we prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place by allowing rates of rent to skyrocket so that people cannot afford affordable, safe, and sustainable housing. I talk to women almost every day who are in unsafe roommate situations because they have no way to get housing for themselves and their children. I talk to senior women who are in unsafe shared housing situations. Housing justice is women's justice. It's domestic violence justice. It's racial justice. It's all of these things rolled into one. And I just want you to recognize that these are people. They're not children and they're not stupid. There are multiple paths to homelessness. There are multiple paths for them to get out. And we need to look at the holistic. We can't point our fingers at people and blame them for their lot in life when we have systemic issues that we have to tackle. I could talk about this all day. I'm going to yield the rest of my time, but Council Member Hines, you are my councilman. I want to talk to you. I want to have a dialogue. I want to, because I'm a real out of the box kind of gal. So I really want to have this conversation. I don't want to be hostile, but right now I'm frustrated and I'm angry.
Thank you, Kathy.
Happy to chat with you or find a time to sit down with you, Kathy.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
And one more hand, and then we'll let you escape, and we'll look forward to providing feedback on Tuesday. So Ed, you have the floor.
John, thank you for being here. I'm sure you realize you've put your foot in it, and from our conversation that we had earlier this year, I know your intent is that this will work out to benefit our homeless neighbors. A couple of things. Garrett put in the chat that we usually have 30, maybe 40 beds available on any given night. When that becomes 1,300, then we're getting close to what's needed, because I know many of us don't like to talk about it because they're overwhelming numbers, but you know, we have thousands on the street, not hundreds. So in your planning, we may have just blown the budget, but I think you need to look at those numbers rather than the little numbers that we have. Secondly, would this be enforced by your outreach teams, your HEAL team, whatever we call it now, or would it be the general police department?
It's a great question, Ed. This is going to be the part of the administrative side of the policy. My point would be, I would admit it. My intention would be the HEAL team would continue to do it, and we're adding in the next budget more people to the HEAL team, looking ahead. So,
okay, because working with the police, I think they've got enough to do. Yeah. And so when you combine this with the sweeps, I think the potential to create a bad situation is there, but I think also there's a potential that if the city will step up and talk about the realistic numbers, I'd be happy to talk to them about the realistic numbers. So thank you for being here, and let's hope good things come out of it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I can pause for 1 second, Rob. I just want to take one kind of final thing. Thank you, Ed. And Caleb is here with us from the city, so he'll be able to, him and I will debrief after this is all over. Let me just say, I'm reading the chat as I'm trying to be a good listener and listening to people, but I see the chat flying through. And the comment that came off that I just want to really make sure I say to this one. Somebody said, if there was political will, we'd set up shelters all over the city. And then we had politicians that had courage. I just want to point out for 1 second that there's a shelter a block from my house, Thames 3, that I like fought hard for. There was never a shelter north of 6th Avenue till I sat in this seat. And when I tried to set that thing up, my neighbors told me to my face that I was bringing pedophiles and rapists here that were going to murder my neighbors. I had someone circulate my cell phone number on a flyer saying that I was bringing rats and feces and encampments and all sorts of horrible things to my neighborhood. And I stood up and I never wavered and I never waffled until they got here. And some of the people in this room thanked me for my willingness to do that. So I believe we need to provide shelter for people, flat out. And I think somebody asked, like, do you support a safe camping site? Yes, I do. We're going to need one. And I've had conversations with people like, well, John, should we do this policy first? Or should we wait until we have all this stuff set up? And my answer to that question is, well, trust in government is so low that I don't think I can go to a neighborhood and say, hey, we're going to set up a safe camping site. But when we do that, we may potentially not let people camp around it. I think we need to have this policy in place first, and then it will help us find more locations, get more partners, put more things up in the future. And that's what I'm really hoping to accomplish here. And somebody that asked, Rob, I think asked, like, John, what is this going to do to end homelessness? And I would leave you all with this conversation as we talk going forward. Is the city is doing a lot of things to end homelessness, right? We're providing funding for temporary shelter sites. We're providing funding for our partners that are providing shelter sites. We passed the 1/10 of 1% sales tax that's on the city council for affordable housing and permanent affordable housing. We're looking ahead at our budget. We're going to put a lot of money behind homelessness. We're doing a lot of things. I understand it's not enough. The first thing you'll tell me is, John, that's not enough. But we are doing that. So if we're having a conversation going forward, what I really like to talk to people about is how do we address the impacts of encampments, not just on the neighborhoods they're in, but on the people who are living inside of them. That's where I want to have the conversation about. So if you're gonna, I want to talk about how do we address encampments, and what do we do to make sure there are fewer encampments here? That's really what I want to make sure. That's where the conversation goes. 5 blocks, 10 blocks, 12 blocks, 6 blocks. That doesn't matter to me as much as how do we make sure we're addressing encampments here, and how do we make sure that when people come off the streets into our shelters, they're safe? And how do we make sure that neighbors that take on the burden of shelters are safe? So thank you very much for you all. And I knew walking in here that this was not going to be you all weren't going to be like cheering me on. I understand that. So, and I really appreciate that. And I just would say that I know what this policy is going to do, right? Because for you all, you don't like this one. And for the people who are most like agitated about homelessness aren't going to like it either, because I'm not banning camping across the whole city. And we're not like going really draconian on this. I'm trying to split the difference. So, thank you all.
Yeah, and if you have just a moment, you may want to see the results. I see your hand up, Zoe, but I do want to move on so we can move to other topics for our meeting, and we will come back to this with some breakout conversations in this.
And I can always come back again in the future if
Sure.
you would like me to, Rob.
Yeah, perfect. And Garrett, would you like to queue up the short poll that you created?
Sure, although I've kind of lost the ability to put the poll up. Something happened with my Zoom.
Really?
So
Well, maybe I can do it.
Yeah,
Let's
see if
see.
you have it.
Let's see. Is it
Supposed
the
to
one
be
you
under-
titled?
It's under the more, but all I have is the breakout rooms.
Is it the one? Okay, I see it. So here we will do a short poll.
So this is a real quick poll. It's completely anonymous. So, your secret self can do it. I put an abstain in there, but I hope no one picks that, right? Even if you don't think you're supposed to, go for it. No one's going to find out. So really, are you for this camping ban? Are you not sure and you haven't decided? Are you against it? Or are you going to abstain? Even though you don't have to, because it's anonymous.
And obviously, Councilmember Hines, this is highly scientific.
Response bias is a real thing.
Good to get a sense of the room sometimes, right?
Yeah, yeah. All right, give it a moment here just for a few more folks to respond.
Oh man, I don't get to vote. Dang.
Neither do I. I think this is rigged. Fake poll.
When you release your numbers, just add yours.
Yeah, there you go. All right, so just a moment longer. We've got about 60 out of the 71 folks who have responded. Let me go ahead and wrap this up in the interest of time and share the results. So at least there's a sense of where folks are at in the room at this time. Again, appreciate you coming, and we will encourage folks to come talk to the full council and to listen in on the conversation from study session on Tuesday.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. All right, so let's, obviously we've blown the agenda for today out of the water, but that's okay. What I am going to do is, why don't we run through any of our regular government updates? And then I think in the interest of wrapping up this topic a little bit with a little more discussion, we'll do a review of last week's breakout conversation that Timothy prepared, and then have a breakout conversation around this topic, which should continue to be quite lively. So let's start with government updates. But Caleb, I don't know if you're able to join us to give any additional City of Tacoma content that we need to know about.
Don't have any updates other than the strategy will be moved a couple of weeks for full council. It won't fall on that 13th because of this added additional conversation. So we'll push that presentation a couple of weeks.
Oh, okay. I wasn't aware of that. That's good information. Thank you. Any updates from Pierce County Human Services?
I'll jump in with a little bit there. I don't have a lot, except I've talked some about our upcoming shelter notice of funding availability, and we have changed our mind in how we're going to do that. So we have 4 separate funding streams coming in, and we decided it would be a good thing to put all those together into one, so that you could maybe meld some of them together, or at least not have to do an awful lot of applications in just one. So I'm not sure when that's going to launch. Probably not for probably a month or so. So the chunk that we're waiting on is $4.6 million of capital to construct or purchase or remodel or something for a medical respite shelter. So that would be a shelter basically with a medical clinic built into it. We have about $5 million that's been set aside for a hotel-based shelter. We always discuss it as being in Fife, but it's not really limited to there, but it's about 5 million of, we call it the Fife Hotel shelter funding. We have 3.4 million that has mixed into that 800,000 of capital, and about 2.4 million or 2.6 million of 2 years of operations of a shelter. And the specification on that is that it's in an underserved geographic area, read not in Tacoma. And the final bit is the unified, is kind of the shelter access point. And that money is 5 million, about half capital and the other half operations, to have somebody to basically coordinate shelter availability and have a location that folks can just come to. Anyway, all those are probably going to get wrapped into a single notice of funding availability, and perhaps some additional funding will come into that. And that'll, again, probably be 30 to 45 days. So bummer, because I was looking forward to the 3.4 million coming out, but I think it'll be easier for our providers if we delay that. So that's my news piece, and you could shoot other questions in chat if you have other questions about things coming up.
Perfect. Thanks you, Garrett, or thanks you. I apparently cannot speak any longer, so I should hand off to Jenny with updates from the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department. Or at least I thought I saw Jenny on the meeting.
Hi.
Earlier. Hi, there
I'm
you
here.
are.
I just put a bit of food.
How
in
is
my
your
food.
meal?
It's good. It's homemade granola. I started making granola. It's delicious.
Nice.
anyhow, apologies, folks. I'm so happy to be back with you this morning. The plague finally came to our home a couple weeks ago. My kiddo and I both had it. We got stuck in Alaska for an extended vacation. Anyhow, it's been a thing. So I have missed being with you all. I will just give some quick COVID and monkeypox updates. Our hospitalizations with COVID are down, which is great news. You've probably heard there's a new and improved booster that's coming soon. We are still waiting for our standing order. So our clinics, standing orders is what we get from the Department of Health. So there are local pharmacies that already have the booster. It's called the bivalent booster. And then our clinics will have them very soon as well. And so the importance of this booster is that it is targeting the original strain and also the currently circulating BA4 and 5 Omicron variants. So very effective and really important for folks. So anyone 12 and over is eligible. You need to wait 2 months from your last booster. And then the other caveat is if you've had COVID. So for example, for me, I had COVID a month ago. I'm going to wait 3 months to get my booster. So because when you've had the infection, you have some immunity. So pushing out a couple months to get the booster if you have had the infection is important. But otherwise, folks are eligible and you should go and get that booster and encourage others to get it. We still have resources to do shelter-based COVID vaccine clinics, but uptake has been low there. We've had a couple great events at Tacoma Rescue Mission, and I will continue to encourage folks to take us up on the opportunity and resources for that. We still are dealing with monkeypox. We're in emergency response mode with that, but cases are plateauing nationwide and locally, so that is great. We have about 40 cases as of, I think, yesterday afternoon here in Pierce County. We are pushing for those at risk to get vaccinated. We have lots and lots of vaccine opportunities happening right now. They've been opened up to walk-ins rather than registering people. I will share that. We have a specific monkeypox vaccine page that outlines clearly who is eligible and then shows all the different vaccine opportunities we have. So I appreciate you all getting the information out there. We're partnering a lot with community partners, especially PCAF, Pierce County AIDS Foundation, on these events. And they are actually our primary partner doing a lot of outreach to the community that's at risk for this virus. I've been sending out regular information on how congregate settings can stay safe. Our monkeypox page has additional resources, flyers you can print. I'm going to deliver some 4x6 postcards to street outreach teams that expressed interest. I'm going to do some of that today. And then we are working finally on setting up isolation and quarantine in the case that is needed. We haven't had a case, monkeypox case yet in our shelter system, which is great. But we do want to have isolation and quarantine ready in case folks need a safe place to recover from their illness. And so per usual, I'll share some links, but I'm here to answer any questions if folks have them.
Perfect. Thank you, Jenny. And welcome back, and we hope you're recovering well.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So let's close out government updates, and I'll close that out with an apology. Valerie, if you have things to share about rental assistance, that would be great. We had to bump Valerie's conversation with us due to the previous conversation. She knows where to find us, so we'll get that set up for a future meeting.
Yeah, no problem at all, Rob. I'm always happy to be bumped. So just the update that our notice of funding availability will be coming out next week. So you will get an email through this chain, as well as we're going to do a mass email out to everybody who's ever gotten a county email. It'll also be available on our website. So look for that. If you're interested in applying to provide eviction prevention assistance, I encourage you to apply. We'll be having a workshop next week.
Perfect. All right. So as I mentioned a couple of times, we blew our agenda out of the water. But I do think it's important that we do the review of last week's breakout conversations. And then if everyone agrees and would like to, it'd be good to have a bit of a breakout conversation around the discussion we had with Councilmember Hines. So I can share the document if you'd like to walk through it, Timothy.
Great. I'll go through this as quickly as I can because I know we're pressed for time. So the question last week was, are there specific strategies or approaches that you believe the Unified Regional Authority should support, and what criteria should we use to assess other plans or models in regard to appropriateness and feasibility? So I broke that out into the discussion into 3 sections: some considerations around model comparison, some strategies and approaches that the URA should support, and then finally there's this other considerations catch-all category at the end that I will not bother to summarize. So in terms of model comparisons, it was pointed out that there are already some regional models that we should look at, the PSRC model, and what was the other one? There was another one in there somewhere. I'm not finding it right now. There's a request to look at various factors of success in the models with an eye to how those apply to Tacoma, Pierce County specifically, and to run it through that filter. They're again looking at the structure of it. There are various opinions about what will fly and what won't fly, and a request that we look at specifically what's going to be viable here in Pierce County. And then people said that we should look at data collection methods for stuff that will work here. Silo reduction is something that people were really interested in looking at. And scoring matrix was something that people were really interested in gleaning from these other models. Moving on to specific strategies and approaches the regional authority should support. There was, a lot of feedback here and a lot of diversity to the feedback. So this is going to be the briefest of summarizations. Looking at how to better support underserved communities in Pierce County. Looking at how to increase the resources from, private sources, philanthropy, public sources without increasing grant competition. Some thoughts about improving the count, maybe increasing the frequency of the count. Several thoughts on honoring lived experience when setting this thing up, and several comments about, focusing on equity as well. Some feedback that we should strive toward less police involvement as we're working on the unified regional strategy. Depoliticizing the policy making through this as much as possible, and improved communication and messaging is another outcome people want to see out of this. Boosting housing dollars, obvious but worth saying. Again, helping smaller jurisdictions get funding. Expediting the permitting process is something that people wanted to see addressed. Increasing opportunities for empowerment and collaboration are thoughts that came up, and improving the contracting experience within Pierce County, and focusing on creating accountability around client outcomes. So that's the quick summary. I do want to note that I won't be here next Friday. I'll be out of the country, but I am happy to summarize the chat. So I'll email you about that, Rob.
Perfect. And thank you as always, Timothy. I also received a summary from Reed and his team that he emailed me yesterday, and I'll drop that in the chat before the end of the meeting when we come back from breakout conversations. In the interest of time, I'd like to pop into breakout conversations. And I'm trying to formulate what this question will even be. We did see where our room, what the temperature of the room is regarding the proposal. And I think we all understand there's an opportunity to provide feedback to the city council directly next Tuesday evening, as well as to listen to the conversation about this proposal during the study session. I also will note, we'll probably want to watch the media. I don't know if folks recognize, but Matt Driscoll was in the meeting earlier today. So he didn't stay all the way through the end, but he was here for part of it. So there'll probably be a column coming sometime this weekend related to this. But why don't we just have some general reaction conversation in small breakout rooms about how you feel about this proposal and what you believe that the coalition should do in response to this proposal. Why don't we focus on that?
And Rob, remember the take space and make space, so don't take up the whole 5 minutes with our passion.
Yeah, thank you very much for that reminder. And what I'm going to do is I'll set us up in 10 rooms. Again, the same routine. Please someone take notes and bring them back here to the chat. We only really have about 10 minutes to do this. So that will be very critical to what Rosemary said about making sure that we get a broad perspective from everybody. And I'm going to stop yammering and just send us off to rooms. Away we go. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully, I know that was not very much time, but I do want to carve out and encourage folks to take the time to put your notes in the chat. I do hope it was a good conversation. You can help inform how the coalition, what the coalition should do in response to the proposal. I guess I would close out today's meeting encouraging everyone, if you have the capacity to do so, to listen in to the city council's conversation during study session next Tuesday at noon. And that email will be sent out to the full coalition so folks are aware of how to join that. And then also that there's the opportunity to actually make public comment during the city council meeting Tuesday night. So both those things will go out to the full mailing list for folks as a follow-up. And I want to let everybody know I appreciate the conversation and that we were largely respectful to each other and to the council member for his appearance here. Teresa, I see your hand up.
Just a quick thing. Can people just email you the notes from this? Many of us don't have time to type it up.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Or should we email them to Timothy?
Why don't you send them to both of us, actually?
Okay.
If that's the case.
Will do.
Okay. But if you do have the ability to put them in the chat, we already have a system to deal with that. So please do. And as always, we will have a small group of us doing planning for upcoming meetings. So if you have the capacity to stay on the meeting, that would be great to have your voice involved in that. And thank you, Kenny, for including information about how people can join the meetings on Tuesday to provide their comments. That it will be in the chat and will be posted on the website as well. So thank you, everyone. I know today was a little more chaotic than usual. Appreciate each of you. And I hope everybody has a safe weekend. Stay out of the smoke. Stay cool tomorrow. And thank you ahead of time for anybody who's going to be providing water and aid to those who are out on the streets.